Hello and good afternoon everyone, and thank you for joining our Trend Micro webinar this afternoon. So we're joined here by Ed Cabrera, Chief Cybersecurity Officer at Trend Micro, and we also have Luke Kiernan, Security BDM here at Bytes. Okay, so I'm now going to pass you over to Ed.
What we've noticed really, which was really concerning, was an exponential growth in the number of variances of ransomware that we've been seeing. Just to put it in perspective, we saw 50 variances in the first 5 months of 2016, whereas we had 49 variances between 2014 and 15. So obviously, what I'll get into is this criminal underground and the ecosystem really supports these types of attacks and really is what fuels these types of attacks. And to really show and highlight that what we're seeing from the criminal underground, that they're really focusing on automation and orchestration in their attacks. Another couple key reports that we saw was the PhishMe report. As of end of March, 93% of all phishing emails contain encryption ransomware. And then Infoblox came out with a report recently saying ransomware domains were up by 3,500% in the first quarter alone. So it's obviously an alarming trend, but I think it goes back to a much deeper story. I talk about the criminal undergrounds, specifically Eastern Europe and Russian-speaking undergrounds, as probably being the most mature and prolific. They've been pretty much the focus of U.S. federal law enforcement since the early 2000s, and the reason being is that from the very beginning they've been able to really communicate and collaborate on the largest data breaches that we've seen, and that goes not only in the U.S. but elsewhere. And so when I talk in terms of the threat landscape and the evolution of that threat landscape, I see ransomware and the crypto-ransomware threat as just another line of business that we've been seeing over the years. It's truly has flipped the business model. I always talk in terms of the business model being, the cybercrime handbook for criminals. It has several chapters for them to monetize their attacks. Well, really ransomware creates this new business model where it's a B2B, so to speak, or C2C, so criminal to criminal, and with an element of direct sales and direct marketing. In other words, a lot of these breaches that we see and talk about that go back several years in the retail sector, from Target to the financial sector, JP Morgan Chase, you see a lot of these attacks. Obviously, they're taking, take minutes or seconds for them to do the initial compromise, but it takes months or years for them to detect. And there's a reason for it, right? These cyber criminals are actually doing their homework once they've compromised a network to identify and understand the networks that they're in and to identify the data that is most valuable within the criminal underground. So it could take months for them to really monetize their attack. Where ransomware, it's just completely different. They are able to monetize, thanks to the automation piece of the malware that we're seeing, is they're able to monetize these attacks fairly quickly, within days, if not weeks. If you could see from this particular slide, you see the sort of evolution in capability and the types of attacks and where they've pivoted. So what I'd like to draw and like folks to understand is that the criminal underground is no different than the surface web that we operate. So from a business perspective, it's all about return on investment. They all look and focus on what they need to do to really monetize and make money. And their sophistication does not necessarily come from the actors themselves, because they have automated a lot of this. There is still a core group of very sophisticated actors that conduct some more your sophisticated long-term targeted attacks. However, here with the ransomware, they've essentially created an industry, a cottage industry of ransomware as a service. So I think that's where we're seeing the huge uptick. But this is basically, it's just sort of showing you over the years on the types of attacks and how they've moved and improved their capabilities. And I always talk about the criminal underground like the rising tide. Well, the analogy of the rising tide lifts all boats, and collectively within these undergrounds, they've been able to really build capacity for their efforts. In other words, they're able to share and trust each other, not only to conduct the attacks, but they're also able to share their wares, so to speak. So it's a marketplace not only for products and services, but a marketplace for ideas for their next criminal attack. So here on this slide, we talk about the ROI and the direct sale model, and it just shows here, and I don't want to read the slide, but I think it's pretty telling here that even the FBI is reporting that in the first 3 months of 2016, they're reporting over $209 million being profited from these attacks. And I would almost argue that that might even be a low number. And the reason why I say that is because the shift and evolution of ransomware attacks has really gone from really the consumers and consumer-based model going after the consumers, which they still do, but they've shifted to the enterprise. And like I was saying earlier, with different sectors and different verticals being targeted, you're seeing them really becoming much more savvy in their targeting processes. I think there's still a vast amount of emails and infections via emails, and what we're seeing is through your typical spam campaigns, but I'll get into a little later, but they're also really increasing the usage of exploit kits. But here, just go back to the money. It just really shows what we're looking at on how they're able to really monetize. I bring back to an example. I was out in Los Angeles having a dinner with some colleagues, and one of my colleagues there said that just to highlight the fact that we're not just talking about the healthcare, he mentioned that a good friend of his was the information security director for a major global law firm, and they had actually paid upwards to 500,000 US dollars. Now, to the extent that's anecdotal, I haven't heard anything more, but arguably, if you're looking at an industry that possibly is vulnerable from a cybersecurity perspective and has critical data and has the means to pay, they by all means become real big targets. Another example I had, just to show the level of profiting that you can pretty much infer, is I had another example when I was in Los Angeles, and one of the colleagues there in our meeting mentioned that he had a friend that was a costume designer, so nobody really associated with an enterprise or big corporation. She was targeted, she was attacked. They proceeded to be on the phone call with her for an hour to do customer service, right? They really wanted her to be able to understand how to find Bitcoins, how to exchange into Bitcoins, and make her payments. So you look at that and you can almost infer, if you have the time and the resources to provide online and chat services, which I'll go into now, but also somebody who's going to get on a phone call for an hour to walk through a payment of $600, you understand that probably the back end, and pretty much can infer the financial money or the financial gain that's happening right now in the back end from these attacks. So the ransomware is an evolution. We started 2005-ish, fake AV, moving into your traditional ransomware, your locker type ransomware. Really, there was no encryption going on. There were some zip files processes going on, but it wasn't until really 2013, really, we've really started to see crypto ransomware come on the scene. And in 2014, we actually saw 80% of the malware that we were detecting and blocking was of that generic blocking type variant of the malware. And we only saw 20% in the crypto ransomware variety. And so this is where it really got our attention in 2015, because then we had a switch, an 80-20 switch, where 80% of the ransomware we were detecting and blocking was crypto ransomware. And then only, 17% here shown were actual, the other lesser than lethal pieces of ransomware. So I mean, for us, when we look at this, then that's when we started thinking that this is going to be an emerging problem, and that's what pretty much has led to our predictions. I'm going to go into some recent crypto ransomware activities. This is a sort of a breakdown. I'm going to go through January, February, March. I'm not going to get into May and June, but just a highlight from our perspective of the types of ransomwares and the variants that we're seeing. So we broke it down by capabilities too, and also how we're seeing it. So the first line is you're seeing where our SPN detection is our smart protection network. It's our cloud-based threat intelligence analytical platform. And so we actually saw them with these. You look at it, you're not many variances in January. You see that the actual infection vector, by all means, very static in the sense is they're all usually during spam campaigns. Then you get into mode of payment. This is where you see some consistency through each month that they're really focusing on Bitcoin. And I think the general consensus, they're focusing on Bitcoin because it's relatively known, so you don't have to be somebody involved in information security. You don't have to be somebody who's been working with virtual payments systems to understand what is a Bitcoin. So I think they really have focused on providing the easiest method for them to get their payments, to really transfer money, extortion money, globally across borders utilizing Bitcoin. And so the next thing is your encrypted data. I mean, you look at the file types, database files, zip files, web pages. I mean, pretty much your standard fare. And then you get into the encryption piece and how they're all set up. And then I think the most interesting is the last layer is self-destruct. None of the ransomware variants that we were detecting in January had any capability to self-destruct, self-deleting files to avoid detection. Not only detection, but also decryption. So you find here in February, same thing, you're looking at, almost the same amount of variances really picking up, but now you have different infection vectors, right? You have exploit kits being utilized. You also have, additional attachments, PDFs and macros being utilized, but also now you see a little bit of mode of payment, still the same as the Bitcoin, and then the files. But I think what's interesting here is they start to increase their files that they're going after. So they understand that from a marketing perspective or from a sales perspective, the more files or more critical files that they can actually go after, probably the best chances of them getting paid, right? So you have web pages being targeted, but then you also have Locky. Locky really at the right here is probably the most one of the most virulent variants we've seen thus far, but also because not only in its ability to propagate, but it's also the fact that you're looking at the different file types. And ultimately, what I'm interested in is the self-destruct piece, right? So self-destruct is one of the the new variants, it actually has that self-destruct feature, showing us a level of sophistication, right? An evolution of the ransomware. And then lastly is March, and as you can tell, that is an incredibly busy slide. And if you look at all the different variances that have really started to come into play, now we're looking not only an increase in the amount of variances, we're also looking at the increase in vectors, infection vectors, which really interesting is one with Petya in the middle here had a job application with Dropbox link, right? So actually compromising a Dropbox account with a malicious file. So I mean, and again, increase in use of exploit kits as well. So as you go down, again, the thing that sort of stays constant, because they understand that they want to get paid and make it as easy as possible for their victims, it's Bitcoin. You go down, now you have all kinds of data being targeted for encryption, to include gamings. And then obviously, because of the time, it's March here in the United States, it's tax season. April 15th is your deadline, and so going after tax files obviously creates a level of anxiety of any victim who's trying to get their taxes done. And so this really shows you that they're obviously constantly evolving, not only to make their products their ransomware much more effective, but they're looking to really expand and be able to be that piece of ransomware that is much more effective. Because obviously this becomes, and what we've seen within the criminal undergrounds, these pieces of ransomware then are almost, they're competing with each other. Because if you look at the lines of business and the business units that are being created within the criminal underground, these ransomware as a services, if they're building their businesses around, very effective pieces of ransomware, then obviously their business is going to get better. And so, I mean, I didn't show or talk about it in the slide about the financing piece, but the ransomware as a service is really that growth industry. I mean, they're charging 10% for 10% of their gross sales, so to speak, for basically doing the entire ransomware attack, and also handling the payments from these attacks. So they'll basically are able to provide end-to-end services for other criminals. And then lastly, as you see, the self-destruct capability is becoming much more in use, trying to avoid not only detection but decryption. Okay, I'm just going to go real quickly in some of the variances that we've seen. I think Zcrypt ransomware for the enterprise is possibly one of the more concerning ones for me, because it has a worm-like function. And sitting with the Chief Information Security Officer just 2 weeks ago, that was his biggest concern with ransomware, was self-propagation of any type of ransomware. And so I think this one for the enterprise is one of the first ones at the top of my head. As much as we are seeing it, we're not seeing it as much. However, we're seeing the increase in enterprise capabilities, or an increase in their capability to attack enterprises. So let me go on to the next one. CryptXXX ransomware. Right now, this was predominantly being delivered by Angular Exploit Kit, but obviously since Angular Exploit Kit has been brought down due to some recent arrests now in June, I think they've pivoted to now RIG or Neutrino, I believe, exploit kits to deliver their actual ransomware. So the exploit kits provides them a different vector, right? So through exploit kits, just like they're able to deliver other pieces of malware, exploit kits are highly modular and essentially enable criminals to infect legitimate websites and really infect unsuspecting users or visitors to those websites. And so it's just another vector beyond the spam and the malicious email or link. vector. So Locky ransomware, malicious word macro. Again, I think with Locky, like I mentioned before, I think the most interesting and concerning thing is that a lot of these pieces of ransomware are highly automated in the sense that they're actually not only looking for map drives within that endpoint, within that host, but they're also looking for network drives, and the malware itself is then reaching out to see and check the connections of that particular host, and if there's any active connections and if there's any active drives that this particular ransomware can actually go after. So it's not only in the method of delivery, which I think is spam, email, phishing attacks, waterhole attacks. I think those are always going to be successful, unfortunately, because it really goes after the human behind the keyboard. So social engineer attacks. But I think what's more concerning is how these pieces of ransomware are actually, once they infect an endpoint, what are their processes and what are they doing to not only avoid detection, decryption, and really looking to propagate. Petya ransomware overwrite of the MBR master boot record. I think here was interesting with Petya. Petya became a concern to us because obviously now it introduced a level of destructive capability with overwriting the MBR. So I like to think of ransomware in the family, and I think some would disagree with me in the purest form, but I think, when you talk about destructive attacks, you're really looking at ransomware is really akin to your destructive wiper malware that exists out there. So here Petya sort of brings in both, right? So if you're not paying, they're going to delete files. So there's this psyche that they want to build this environment and really pressure victims to pay and pay quickly. So you're looking at anywhere from 24 hours to I think as much as 90 hours. I think that some of these ransomware families were creating that shot clock, so to speak, that countdown clock really for folks to actually pay, and if not, there's other consequences. So that's what we saw really moving into, is this particular function of deleting the actual files. Cerber, interesting thing that we noticed, was one of the first ones from going Reviton and the police ransomware families back in the early 2000s or mid 2000s, had some audible functions, but Cerber has basically an audible function. It's basically saying alert, 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 you've been encrypted. So what's interesting with Cerber was the picture here to the lower right. It shows these different languages, and so the modular functionality of this particular ransomware that you can buy or get as a service. It had different languages listed, but when our researchers first pulled it up, English was the only one actually available. So I haven't contacted or got back to our researchers and see if it actually has increased. I think Maktub ransomware, from sheer business, I think, appreciation, I think you're seeing so much more, even in the graphic graphic arts work that's going into a lot of these ransomware and these pages and ransomware notes. It's pretty interesting that they're looking to really provide that impression that it's a very professional looking, that you should be scared. This is not just some text note, plain text note. This is actually something that shows you that it's a business behind this, and it's general consensus within the researchers that that's the actual effect that they're trying to achieve. They're trying to say, hey, listen, why fight it, just pay it. So there are some other just similar screenshots of exactly how they're providing the web pages in a way that is a sort of it's a psychological effect. So SamSam ransomware was I thought more of a concern, obviously, because now we're talking a threat to basically servers, and so really going after servers. So SamSam really represented sort of a shift, not only going from the endpoints and files, but actually going after the servers themselves directly. Jigsaw, one of my favorites. Jigsaw, and obviously the character there is a puppet from the horror movie Jigsaw, where again they're incorporating some psychological warfare, so to speak, trying to scare their intended victims. To the right, you see there's actually that countdown clock, that shot clock, but what they've done is they've gotten a little farther into that psyche, right? So they basically said, if you don't pay, not only are your files gone forever, but we're actually going to exfil that data, and then we're actually going to share all your private data, including pictures, videos, and just publish on on the internet. So it's just such a doxing thing. So another aspect to this is really we talked about the destructive capability, but now we're looking at your traditional breach type capability of actually taking the data and either selling it or, obviously here, as they say, putting it out there to shame their victims. What was really interesting is with Jigsaw, and what I mentioned earlier, is this customer satisfaction you find within the criminal underground. Right now there is an incredible amount of competition with these criminal undergrounds, and so these ransomware as a services and so forth, they really need to differentiate themselves, and having this capability, it's just providing an additional service for their for them to enable some to obviously reap more benefits from their attack, right? But it just shows them, if I'm a criminal and I'm shopping for a particular piece of ransomware, I'm looking at not only the ransomware itself, but also the services that go along with it, right? Because if I'm a criminal, I want to make as much money as fast as I can, and as easy as possible, right? So they're looking for that ROI in their attacks. So protection, best practices, and solutions. Protecting against ransomware. I know this is pretty much almost what you hear from just about anybody talking about ransomware attacks is backup and restore, and it is true. It's possibly the best foolproof, best practices that you can actually do is backup and restore. However, I will say this, that you definitely, we have a 3-2-1, 3 copies, 2 formats, and 1 in air-gapped network is what we recommend. And that last piece is very important, is that air-gapped from the network, because, like I was saying earlier, they are looking not only for files, but now they are looking for backups. And so that's possibly the best practices that anybody can really provide, is you just really want to be resilient. You want to be able to withstand an attack. And obviously you don't want to get to that point and be in that situation, but other best practices come into play. Keep current with patching. I always say, when you want to improve your cybersecurity posture, you want to be much more mature program. I really think focusing on 2 efforts of increasing time or speeding up your detection time of an attack, and also speeding up your patch time. If you were to focus on 2 things to keep your organization secure, I think focusing on those 2 things, you can't really go wrong. And it really, the end result is becoming much more resilient. So I wouldn't want to oversimplify what you need to do from a cybersecurity perspective. It's always a layered approach, but I always say it's a connected layered approach, where you really need to be able to do the same thing that these actors are doing, is that you need to be able to automate and orchestrate your defense, right? You need to be able to improve your defense. Employee education on phishing, and I think this is, again, like a backup and patching, this is very important, right? However, this alone will not improve your cybersecurity posture. I think this is a constant and be a must, and the different things that I've heard from other CIOs and CISOs is, there's a lot of focus on the carrot and stick approach, more focused on the stick than the carrot, and I would suggest that you really look at coming up with creative ways for the carrot. In other words, really trying to find ways to reward individuals as you do your anti-phishing education and exercises. I think really approaching it from both ends is necessary, but education is always a must. Access control, this goes back to least privilege, right? You really need to understand who are your privileged users and who are your general users, and you really need to break it down and really go by the rule of least privilege, right? If they don't need to have access to any data, then they should not to do their business, right? For their daily business. And don't pay ransomware. I think arguably it's a tougher decision that an organization has to make if they haven't done any of the things that we just mentioned. But I think at a larger scale, it just feeds into the actual the problem that we have now. I mean, you wouldn't have a cottage industry of these extortions attacks if people weren't paying. So obviously, do not pay. And then overall, improve your security posture. I always talk about framework first. I always like the idea of really where you start your security program is by adopting a framework. And from there, you're able to build a much more cohesive strategy that you can build upon. The one I like the most is the NIST cybersecurity framework. I think it's extremely comprehensive and is able to map security controls to 5 core functions such as identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. I think having a framework that you're able to brief the board with, but also brief the server room with is critical. Ransomware targets. I think we talk about servers. Servers obviously are the holy grail when it comes to data within an enterprise. I think there is fewer attacks going directly after the servers, but it's actually increasing. And again, this goes back to vulnerabilities. I think the biggest piece there to help protect is your vulnerability management, becoming much more robust, much more resilient, and speeding up your patch cycles. The network, you're possibly seeing, possible point of entry, but this is definitely where the network, not having a detection capability at the network level to be able to detect not only the command and control functions of these particular ransomwares, but also to detect the lateral movement and the actual the work within the breach, actively looking for other file shares on the network. That activity, you really need to have that robust detection capability on your network. And then, the endpoints. They're the most, the biggest target, right? And it's all through, web and spear phishing, and these types of attacks, again, it's the harder to defend because they really are targeting users directly, right? Like any other attack to gain the initial foothold. So if you look at targeted attacks in the different stages of an attack, obviously these ransomware attacks are no different. They're looking for the easiest point of entry, right? And then that's where they're focusing their efforts. And then from there, they're able to then move on with relative ease. So we talk about what's the effective layered approach. I think I'll show some statistics here towards the end here, but I want to say really the email gateway, having spear phishing protection, malware, sandboxing, and IP web reputation is critical, because I think this is where you're stopping a lot, right? The web gateway is critical too, and I'll show you some numbers here in a minute. Then you look at the endpoint, right? Having the ability, because you really need to have from the endpoint network and server side the protection. And so from the endpoint perspective, again, ransomware behavior monitoring, I'll show you some statistics where not a lot of the detection that we're actually seeing there, that a lot of is being blocked at that email gateway and the web gateway. However, it is the endpoint piece is that last, so to speak, last point of protection that you're going to be looking at. Then network traffic scanning, malware, sandboxing, and lateral movement prevention. I mean, I think the network, like I was mentioning earlier, is critical to detect this type of activity because you can detect it and block it at the gateway, and you can detect it and block it at the endpoint. But if you're not lucky enough, then you also have the detection at the network level. And then finally, web server protection, vulnerability shielding. I think vulnerability shielding is critical. I think anywhere where you can actually help your patch cycle, I think where I always talk about, vulnerability shielding like a tourniquet, right? You just really want to stop the bleeding. If you have a critical vulnerability that comes out, you want to be able to really understand your exposure and quickly patch it, or at least provide the protections around it associated with that particular vulnerability until you can actually provide that critical patch. So, hey, I'm coming to the end, but from the perspective of what, if you were looking at what you needed to do or where you wanted to spend your money, so we looked at some of the, at each of the layers and how effective you can be at blocking and tackling this threat. So you're looking at, this was dated back in May, but we're constantly updating these numbers. But email blocking right now, 89%, right? I mean, you have 30 million hits that we actually were able to block. Then you look at the URL blocking, another 10%. So your malicious domains piece, get 10%, malicious links. And then you look at your file detection, and then you get into your behavior monitoring for known threats, and then your behavior monitoring for unknown threats. And where you might think, well, 0.03% for the behavior monitoring of known threats, well, that's still 10,000 hits that where you're able to block, or we were able to show you could block. And then the behavior monitoring for unknown threats, because in reality, if you're an extremely mature organization and you have your connected layered protection in place in your security stack, that behavior monitoring for unknown threats can actually be very effective at blocking these new variances, right? So the variances that you see that are constantly coming out, so not only are they coming out in such a high rate, but they're also coming out with higher capabilities to avoid sandbox detection, to avoid detection as a whole. And so having that last layer is still a critical piece of your security stack. So I will go into questions here if we have any at this point.
Hi Ed, it's Luke here.
Hey Luke.
Hey, so I'm just going to quickly run over.
I apologize, Luke.
That's all right. I'll just quickly run over a couple of slides, and then we'll go straight into Q&A. But if anyone does have any questions, then feel free to put them in the questions pod whilst I'm going over my couple of slides on some security assessments that Bytes can offer. So as we all know, cyber criminals are obviously becoming increasingly intelligent and staying one step ahead about how they gain access to our data. So that, I guess the question is, with all the security controls in place, is how do you solve a security risk if you're not clear where the risk lies in the first place? So to kind of help that and to echo what Ed has put together, we have put some security assessments in place with our partner Longwall Security, which I'll just go over now, which should hopefully identify some opportunities to help you find out where some risks lie. So the first two, the Advanced Cybersecurity Assessment and the Baseline Cybersecurity Assessment, so the Gold and Silver package, they offer a top-down review of your security estate, so from network to endpoint and everything else in between. It includes policies and compliance checks, testing legacy operating systems, APT tests, DLP risks, and a lot more. So the main difference between the gold and the silver package is the gold offers penetration testing and spear phishing proneness to around 100 users, which I'll go over to in more detail shortly. And then a full agnostic report is then fed back to you with high, medium and low risks and how and what solution should help you to solve those issues. The third offering is a sort of a vendor approved solution health check. So if you do have Trend Micro in-house currently, we can provide an independent validation to your solution to check it's fully installed correctly, fully deployed and configured to deliver best practice and ROI. The last offering is kind of what Ed alluded to in his presentation with regards to training your users. So we can offer a managed security awareness program. So if you provide a list of your users' email addresses, starting from 250 users and above, we can spearfish them with the latest spearphishing templates in order to check their security knowledge in a safe environment. So if they was to click on a spearphishing link, they are made aware, then directed to an online training portal which can be customized to your branding, and they are obviously guided through that security training to make them security aware in the future. You are then provided with a full report of who's clicked, hasn't clicked to the links, or who's been through the online training course and how much they've completed, and obviously the sort of geolocation charts, and hopefully that will give you a more secure workforce going forward. So these assessments are designed to help you and assist you and kind of echo the security layered defense that Trend can offer. So if you do want to find any more information about how Trend and these assessments can help, then obviously let us know at the feedback form at the end. And if you do have any questions, we'll answer them now. Check the question pod. Okay, we've got a question from Rachel. Great.
Hey, Luke, I'm not seeing the questions. Do you?
Yeah, questions just popped up from Rachel. So she's asked what traces post-infection are lurking on hard drive registry, etc.
Well, that is a great question, and I would definitely have to get back to Rachel on it from that perspective. As far as from a technical and from the forensic side of the house, what actual residual or artifacts are left behind on this type of infection, but I can definitely get back to Rachel on that one. And I'm sure it would differ for each variant as well. There probably is some commonalities, but I would definitely, I'll get back to you.
Okay, perfect. So another question, what threats do you think we're going to see in 2017? So kind of predicted ransomware will be the year of 2016, but what do you think is going to be happening in 2017?
I think arguably, what concerns me the most is the growth of which these attacks are able to really take hold, right? And I go back to the problem that we're seeing that there's such automation and orchestration going on within the criminal underground. I just see the destructive attacks being increasing. And what I mean by that is I really do think that your hacktivist groups haven't really touched the actual ransomware capability here, right? So arguably, a lot of these hacktivist groups are not going to want to pay for a ransomware as a service when there's no money to be made. They just want to attack an organization. However, as these services become much more prevalent within the criminal undergrounds, I think other active groups will actually then take these capabilities and use it for other reasons. I think extortion, I think, is here to stay. I think to the extent that we're a hyper-connected and global group of users, right, either at the enterprise or personal users, that I think going after, we saw it with a new version of, it's called Flocker ransomware that just came out, and it was going after mobile, which is nothing incredibly new or interesting, but it brought up a new interesting area, because now that we have so many smart TVs that are running on Android platforms, that now you can essentially go after the media aspect. Now again, that's would go back to more of a consumer-based attack, not necessarily enterprise from that perspective, but I think they're just going to be constantly evolving this attack, and so we're waiting for our first half-year numbers to see what trends we can actually pull out of where we're seeing. I just really think that extortion is here to stay, unfortunately.
Another question. What are the verticals, or what are the main verticals that you're seeing that are having these threats in the UK? It's got law firms, health organisations.
The threats yeah, I really haven't seen, and again, this what happens from even I would suspect, but it's more of a question, and Luke, maybe you can help me out here with this, but in the United States, the reason why we're probably seeing a preponderance of these types of attacks in the healthcare is, again, what I talked about is a critical data and their need to have, their operations, because it's life and safety, right? Their operations unimpeded. I think the other piece, which I talk about in my presentation from a U.S. perspective, there's 47 different data breach notification laws across the United States. And I would bet that if not 100%, nearly 90% of all of them do not even address this type of threat. And what I mean by is that they're not mandated, companies and organizations are not mandated to report that they've been attacked, because these data breach notification laws are really based around protecting consumers, and if a piece of data of a consumer is exfiltrated and sold and it has been compromised, now you can argue, and I think more of it would be an argument for lawyers, of where if a piece of data is encrypted and hasn't been exfiltrated, hasn't been taken out of the environment, some people might argue saying, well, that really doesn't rise to the level of that data breach notification law. So as far as I can only speak to the anecdotal piece, or even just looking from a business perspective. I look at three main things that, from their perspective, that they're probably looking at, right? And I said it earlier. They're looking at verticals that have critical data, right? They're looking for verticals that have immature cybersecurity programs, collectively, or at least by reputation. And then lastly, the ability to pay. So if you really point that little litmus test of these three things that need to be, had across these different types of verticals, from government to financial to, you'll see that, if you look at the financial sector, and this is again anecdotal, we had a meeting in New York with financial sector partners, and I did a very raise your hand survey within the group, and I asked them if they had been affected by ransomware, and one or two things: they weren't completely honest, or possibly their security stack, their maturity model is a little more advanced and is possibly protecting them from these types of attacks. generally. Like if you looked at our statistics, having, a robust email gateway and web gateway protections is where you're going to get the most, bang for your buck, so to speak. You would look at other verticals such as the financial sector as possibly not meeting that test, that they're a little more mature possibly than other sectors that you would say, such as healthcare. So couldn't tell you because we don't have, we're conducting a survey here soon to sort of get a handle on by industry, and a lot of these surveys are coming out daily, but we're trying to get a handle on it too as well, not only from our customer base, but also from what we're seeing as we go out and talk about this threat.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, from the UK point of view, sort of the trends that we're seeing is definitely public sector is kind of being the main target, law firms as well, because they hold a lot of valuable information. But we have seen quite a big rise and a spike in retail customers wanted to find out more information about how they protect themselves, because you do find they may be on legacy systems that need protecting, and obviously with the European laws that may come in 2018, obviously that brings data protection laws, so we're finding a lot more customers wanting to talk about encryption, as you mentioned there. So the trends are fairly similar from UK to US. I mean, ransomware, it'll be global from my point of view, and be on the rise in 2017 as well. So just whether and how we kind of combat that and stay one step ahead of the game with a sort of layered defense.
Absolutely.
So I don't think there's any more questions in the chat pod. But if there is anything else you wish to ask, oh, we've got one more question. Sorry.
That's all right.
Okay, another question from Rachel. Are there any variants, if any, of crypto lockers you've seen to date also carrying key lodgers FTP ability?
Well, from the deeper dive into the variances, Rachel, those great questions. You reached my capacity. I will definitely, because I'm afraid if I answer it, considering they change so much, I might be wrong. But we'll definitely get back to you, Rachel, on that one as well. That's for sure.
Okay, perfect. Okay, everyone, so thanks for joining today's webinar, and thank you, Ed, for joining us. A recording will be sent out, as Amy mentioned, tomorrow morning, and if there is any feedback, this will pop up after the presentation has ended. And that's all. Thanks for joining us.
No, thank you for having me. It's been great. Look forward to the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you.